Blizzard has recently updated their loner decks for new and returning players. If you're not familiar with what loner decks are, they are a collection of 6 decks that Blizzard gives players to give them a head start in their collection, and also just to give them a starting point of when to play this game. It's a very cool system, and a lot of these decks are worth quite a bit of dust. Some of them are worth a little bit less, but I hear a lot of players ask which one is the best one and which one provides the most value moving forward. And when I talk about value, the main thing I'm talking about is just overall dust value. So which of these decks has the most valuable cards in it, aka legendaries and epics, and that is usually what determines what deck a player will decide to choose. So in this video, I am going to go over which decks I personally recommend you don't claim, but also the one that I think would probably be the best one. I'm also going to briefly go over the playstyle of each of these decks and give my overall opinions on how they play, because I have played each of these decks a few times, and I think I have a good understanding of what they're after. So let's go over the 2 decks that I recommend that you don't claim, and it is actually the first one on my screen here, Soulbound Starships. Soulbound Starships has a very interesting playstyle, and you are trying to build your biggest starship possible through things like Soulbound Spire and Arcanite Defense Crystal. And a good way to grow an even bigger starship is to give these pieces reborn. And the premier way to do that is with Brittlebone Buccaneer. That way you can double up on your starships and launch an absolutely massive starship. But what do you even do with this big starship in the late game? Ideally, it has a guiding figure on it, so it can trigger its own death rattle, so you can gain a ton of armor, but also send out a few 10-drop minions from the Soulbound Spire. That is why the deck is called Soulbound Starships, because this is your key piece in the later games. So why am I so low on Soulbound Starships? And it really boils down to the legendaries. So the first one here is the Exodar, a very powerful enabler for the Starship decks, but it is also given to every player for free, so it really doesn't contribute to the dust value of this deck, so I don't even really factor this in when it comes to value. And then we have the very powerful legendary of Reska the Pit Boss. Now, this is very good, especially if you can give it reborn with the Brittlebone Buccaneer, but my main hesitancy with this deck is that this one legendary is going to be rotating out here in April upon standard rotation. If you're not familiar with what standard rotation is, every 2 or so years, standard rotates, which means the 3 oldest sets that are currently in standard will be leaving. And those 3 sets that are rotating is Festival of Legends, Titans, and Showdown in the Badlands, and unfortunately, Reska the Pit Boss is part of one of those 3 sets, so this one legendary that you're going to get from this loner deck will be rotating out here very soon, and for that reason, both the low power level of this deck and also the not so great legendaries you are getting, I am going to recommend Soulbound Starships the least. The next deck that I would steer clear from is Fiery Elementals, and I have covered Elemental Mage a lot of times on this channel, and I honestly love the deck. I love drawing a bunch of cards, I love tempoing out some minions and throwing damage spells at my opponent's face until their hero portrait explodes. That is peak gameplay. I love everything about it. But it is kind of the premier budget deck, so I am not a big fan of claiming this deck for a very similar reasons as Soulbound Starships. There just really isn't much value here. You do get Saroon, and Saroon doesn't rotate out in the next standard rotation, which is great because it's part of the Great Dark Beyond. But the rest of the deck is just full of commons and rares, and most of these commons and rares are rotating out here very soon. I think I counted 13 total cards are rotating out here soon, and a lot of them are pivotal to this strategy, like Tainted Remnant, Aqua Archivist, Flame Revenant, just to name a few. So upon rotation, this deck will pretty much not be a thing. Unless we get a bunch of elemental support, I think Saroon come April is going to be struggling very hard in the next standard season. The next 2 decks are perfectly reasonable decks to claim because a lot of their value is going to be retained after standard rotation, and I also just kind of enjoyed the playstyles of these next 2 decks, and one of those decks is Interstellar Libram, Libram Paladin. So the deck's goal is to, of course, play as many Librams as you can, namely Libram of Divinity, and discount it with the Interstellar Star Slicer. So this is more of a mid-rangey but also kind of aggro play style because you can play a Libram of Faith pretty consistently on turn 4 if you find your Star Slicer, and that is a bunch of stats very early, and it makes this deck very explosive. But the reason I would maybe not encourage people to claim this deck is because of, again, the legendaries. They don't rotate out in next standard season, but they are only playable in the Paladin class. So you are pretty locked in on Paladin. Sunsapper Lanessa is a fantastic legendary minion and will likely be relevant in the next standard rotation. And Sandcastle is a, again, very good legendary, but very limited in what decks it can go in, being that it can only go in minion-focused Paladin decks. But this is a very fine deck to claim. I personally find the playstyle of Libram Paladin very fun, but the downside is you are very much committing to the Libram Paladin class if you do go down this path. Next deck that we have is Asteroid Barrage, Asteroid Shaman. This deck I would recommend slightly more than Libram Paladin because you do have a very good neutral legendary minion in Insidious. You also have Shutterblock, which is a premier legendary minion for the Shaman class. You do have some time to play with Golganath the Thunderer, but Golganath, like all the other Titans, is going to be rotating out here very soon, so your time with Golganath will be very limited. And finally, we have Blood Mage Thalnos. This is a core card, so much like the Exodar, this is a free legendary, so it does not really factor in with the total cost of this deck. I would recommend this deck to fairly newer players. If you are a very experienced Hearthstone player, maybe this deck is maybe a little too simple, but for new players, this is a very straightforward strategy of just shuffle asteroids in your deck, and then play some spell damage minions and make the asteroids hurt your opponent even harder. And the combination of Shutterblock and Insidious is an insane amount of damage and will win you a lot of games with just that combination alone. So if you're newer to Hearthstone and are just kind of learning the ropes, I think that this is a fantastic deck to claim. But if your goal is to maximize on the value of this deck that you're claiming, I would maybe go with one of the next two options. The next deck that I want to cover is Odin Warrior. So this is, I think, one of the top 2 decks that you should be claiming if you are trying to maximize on the value of these loner decks. And the objective of Odin Warrior is fairly simple. It is a hard control deck that is trying to gain armor, remove minions, draw cards, gain a little bit more armor, and remove just a few more minions, until your opponent just kind of runs out of resources and you can finish the game with Odin's very powerful battle cry that changes your armor gain into direct damage towards your opponent's face. While we're on the subject of Odin, I want to cover the other legendaries that you get with this deck with the Ceaseless Expanse, the 100 mana minion that Twisting Nethers the board and also comes with a 15/15, oftentimes for 0 mana. You have Odin, of course. You have Ham the Hungry, the Druid Tourist, that enables you to play some very broken Druid cards. You have Ignis the Eternal Flame, and finally, you have everyone's favorite robot, Ziliax Deluxe 3000. Of these 5 legendaries, 2 of them are going to be rotating out here very soon, with Odin, the main win condition of this deck, and also Ignis the Eternal Flame. Additionally, Ignis the Eternal Flame is a free legendary, so it is a free legendary that's going to be rotating out here very soon, so it doesn't really factor into the deck's total dust cost. But unfortunately, the main win condition of Odin is going to be rotating out here soon, but I would still consider claiming this deck if you do enjoy the Control Warrior playstyle, because the remaining cards that will be sticking around after rotation are very solid, and the core of Control Warrior is still very good. But this may need to change a little bit. I would think that this deck would probably go towards more of a hydration station build and just fill the board with endless waves of taunts, namely Ziliax Deluxe 3000 and a few other premier taunts. So that is probably where this deck is going to go after rotation. But in the meantime, you can enjoy Odining people into oblivion and have a fairly solid Control Warrior core upon rotation. And the final deck that I want to cover, and the deck that I think you should claim, is Discover Hunter, or better known as Spellbound Discoveries Hunter. This is, I would consider this actually to be the most complicated of these 6 decks. At its surface, it kind of just looks like a aggressive hunter deck, but it is a lot trickier than that. It is aggressive in the first turns. It can kind of go mid-rangey control with Exarch Nalia, and it has some very neat combos in the later games with filling the board with alien encounters and where is it? Sneaky Snakes, I believe it's called. There it is. Sneaky Snakes, Awaken the Tremors. You're just trying to go very wide in the late game, and you can finish the game with an Observer of Myths or a, again, Ziliax Deluxe 3000. The robot here again. This one is in the your other minions have +1 attack and is cheaper for each friendly minion you control mode. So this oftentimes is a very cheap robot that anthems your minions to be a little bigger to push for that final bit of damage. While we're on the subject of legendaries, you also have Gorgonzomo, Exarch Nalia, Grifta, and Agramar the Avenger. So quickly going over the legendaries, Agramar the Avenger is a Titan, so he's going to be rotating out here in April, and Gorgonzomo is a free legendary from Perils of Paradise, so that will not factor in to this deck's overall cost. But the 3 remaining legendaries, Ziliax Deluxe 3000, this is in so many decks, it is a very powerful neutral minion. Exarch Nalia is only a Hunter legendary, but I think most Hunter decks will be running this in the very near future. That tracking ability that she gives you instead of the 2 damage hero power is very strong and allows Hunter to keep up with the more greedy decks. And finally, we have Grifta, Trusted Vendor. This guy's been everywhere. He fits in so many strategies. A 4-mana 4/5 with that battle cry is absolutely insane and will steal games on its own. So this sticking around and being in standard for the time being is absolutely worth claiming this deck because he fits in so many strategies being a neutral legendary minion. So overall, I think that these loner decks are very reasonable. I think they give you a pretty good place to start. But I would avoid the Mage and the Death Knight ones. If you want to challenge yourself and also capitalize on the value, I think the Discover Hunter deck is very strong. Odin Warrior is also very good, but if you don't like either of these decks' playstyles, I would then go to Asteroid Shaman because I think this provides the most value now and towards rotation. But if none of these 3 decks are your playstyle and you're really sold on Libram Paladin, Libram Paladin is a perfectly fine option. And if you like these 2 decks, the Soulbound Starships or the Fiery Elementals, I would again recommend you don't claim them. If you love them a lot, I would think that they are pretty easy to craft on their own, and I would highly recommend you explore these 4 middle decks instead, just purely based off of the value that is in them. And that is pretty much all you need to know about this round of loner decks. If you found this video informative at all and would like to see more of Hearthstone related content like this in the future, please consider subscribing. I'm pretty close to that 500 mark, so I'd greatly appreciate a subscription thrown my way. And while you're down there hitting that subscribe button, please consider throwing a like my way as well. It helps these videos out a ton, helps me get in front of a few more people to help them out with what loner decks to claim. And if you do decide to select one of these decks, please let me know which one that you claimed and why you claimed it. Maybe there's something I missed here of the one that you claimed. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Hope you have a good one. Bye. See ya. Fade into black now. Fade into the abyss. See you next time. Subscribe, I guess, if you want to. Please do.